Hello again, everyone. So in this video, we'll be looking at all of the major arguments in favor of voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So here I've listed sort of the 5 main appeals people make in favor of voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And in this video, we'll be looking primarily at numbers 1 through 3. And the next video, we'll be looking at number 4. So the major ways people argue in favor of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is to appeal to the principles of autonomy and beneficence that we've discussed already in this course. They make an appeal to somebody's well-being, or they claim that most of us already accept the moral permissibility of voluntary passive euthanasia, but all of those same reasons apply to voluntary active euthanasia. So if we find voluntary passive euthanasia permissible, then we should also find active euthanasia permissible. So here, all of these major arguments are trying to do roughly the same thing. They're saying, look, you already accept these moral ideas of autonomy, beneficence, and well-being. You see that they apply to other moral areas, and you find them as sort of fundamentally appealing moral principles. And they apply here. All of these things you already value apply to the case of voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So you should think both of those things are morally permissible as well. Okay, so let's jump in then and start looking at the principle of autonomy. So just to remind everybody, the principle of autonomy claims that we have this right to self-determination or self-governance. Right? As rational beings, we can reflect on all the different ways our life could go, and we choose the one that we think fits our desires best. And because we have this special rational capacity, it should be respected, and we have the right to exercise it. So hopefully it's pretty clear how this is going to apply in the case of voluntary active euthanasia. Right? Choices over whether or not our lives are still worth living are fundamental to our self-determination, right? So if we have this right to self-governance and self-determination, that's got to apply in cases where we're determining how to end our lives, right? Those are some of the most sort of intimate personal decisions a person can make about how their life goes. So it's got to be under the umbrella of our right to self-determination. And so to many, this principle of autonomy seems to establish a right to die. Right, so if we would prefer to die, if that's the way we determine our life should go, we should have a right to die. So therefore, voluntary active euthanasia is morally permissible because it allows us to exercise that right to die. If we have a right to die, we need some way of actually exercising it, and voluntary active euthanasia is one way of doing that, so it should be morally permissible. And particularly, it should be morally permissible in cases where we can't perform the action ourselves. Right? So if we are either physically unable or economically or financially unable, right, there should be something to help us exercise this right. One thing, though, that we have to worry about with the appeal to the principle of autonomy is, what does this require of others? Right? So maybe we do have a right to die, but does that mean that others are required to help us in that dying? So Dan Brock, who's one of the authors you read this week, argued that this same appeal to autonomy that might ground the right to die also protects doctors. Right? So doctors who do not want to assist in suicide or perform active euthanasia can also deny those things based on their autonomy, right? They have this duty of they have this right to self-governance and self-determination. And if they determine that those actions are morally wrong or reprehensible from their point of view, or just something that they don't want to take part in, then autonomy also supports those judgments. So then we end up in this weird place, right? We appeal to the principle of autonomy, seems to establish we have a right to die. Well, but maybe nobody has a duty to help us, right? So then maybe we end up with just suicide being on the table instead of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So the appeal to autonomy by itself doesn't seem to get us all the way to voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, unless there's some other consideration that could require physicians to help us. Okay, and here we get some of that with an appeal to well-being. And so some people think it's plausible that a human can calculate their life is no longer a benefit to themselves. Right, so you look at your life, you look at the possible future you have in front of you, at least the most likely future you have in front of you, and you determine it's just not worth living. So some have argued, though, that this whole idea doesn't even make any sense, right? Life itself has inherent value, and this rules out the possibility of life ever failing to be a benefit for you. Right, so times can get tough, things can look bad, but life still just has this inherent value, and that's always going to mean that life is a benefit for you. But in response to this, many have said that just seems implausible, right? Maybe there are a large number of difficult lives that are still worthwhile because life has inherent value, but there's gotta be some lives out there that would be so bad that it would no longer be a benefit to an individual to live. And so, I mean, I'll leave that exercise to you, right? What is a type of life that could be so bad it's no longer a benefit to you? I mean, personally, just to give you an example, if I was born in a third world country with no access to healthcare education, and then I was starving most of the time, and then I became terminally ill, so on and so forth, like, that life seems to me, at least, like it would be no longer a benefit to myself to continue. So here, for the principle or the appeal to well-being to work, we have to think that it's plausible, at least, that a human life could no longer be a benefit to that person. And if that's possible, if you can make that calculation, now we're down here at the conclusion, if it's possible for us to make this calculation about life being no longer worth living, then this supports voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, especially when it's combined with the principle of autonomy, right? So if we have a right to death and we can calculate that our life is no longer worth living, that seems to further support that right to death. Once again, though, it's not clear that this requires a physician or anybody else to help us with that right. In order to get that, we need to appeal to the principle of beneficence. So to remind everybody, the principle of beneficence creates a moral duty for all of us to relieve the suffering of another when we can do so without excessive cost to ourselves. In other words, the idea is if somebody needs our help, right? If somebody's out there suffering and we can help them without causing ourselves harm or without having a huge cost on ourselves, then we have a moral duty to do it, right? Help those in need, especially when it's easy for you to do so. And so it's clear to see how this applies to the case of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. If you have a patient who is competent, requests VAE or PAS, and they're hopelessly ill, right? They're going through severe suffering, either of a mental or physical sort, then we might have a duty of beneficence to aid them in their right to die. Right? So now, finally, because of the principle of beneficence, in addition to the principle of autonomy and the appeal to well-being, we can see why a doctor may be required morally to help us die, right? Which would justify voluntary active euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Especially physician-assisted suicide seems like it would be a way for a doctor to satisfy the principle of beneficence, right? Because if somebody's going through severe suffering and all the doctor has to do in order to eliminate that suffering is provide them with medical advice or a prescription so that they could go commit suicide, that's a very low cost to the doctor themselves, at least on the face of it, right? So if we appeal to all of these principles so far, it seems like not only do we have a right to die, but others might actually have a duty to help us in dying. So voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide would both be ways in which they could help us die. Okay. Going back to our distinction between active and passive euthanasia, the principle of beneficence seems to clearly justify cases of passive euthanasia. Right? If someone's going through this severe suffering and requests to die, and all you have to do is remove a feeding tube, right? at their competent request, it seems like the duty of beneficence kicks in and you would be morally required to do that. There's severe suffering. It's very easy for you to stop that suffering, so you should do it. But one worry people have about this principle of beneficence is that it seems to require more than just passive euthanasia. It seems to require active euthanasia. Because if what we're really worried about is ending people's suffering, then there's going to be cases in which active is actually more efficient at ending the suffering than passive euthanasia. Right? In fact, passive euthanasia in some cases is going to exacerbate people's suffering, while active euthanasia would just end it immediately. Dan Brock and James Rachels both make this point in the articles you read this week. And one case that makes this sort of especially clear is the trucker case, which you read in your textbook. But roughly the idea is that someone could be in a truck accident, right, and they're sort of pinned down in the wreckage and everything's on fire, right, and the person knows, well, I'm going to die, right, but if I die sort of with the way the environment is laid out, I'll slowly burn to death and suffer. But you're walking by and the trucker yells out to you and says, please, for the love of God, help me, take that rock and bash my skull in, right? Because there's no way you can save me, right? Saving me is off the table. Either you can kill me immediately with this rock, or you can sit here and sort of watch me burn to death, right? But really, you have this duty to help me end my suffering. And being passive in the trucker case is going to cause even more suffering. It's going to exacerbate the trucker's suffering. Whereas taking the rock and ending their life immediately, or active euthanasia, would end that suffering immediately. So if you're against active euthanasia, you have a problem, because the principle of beneficence seems to say that active euthanasia is actually morally preferable to passive euthanasia when what we're worried about is ending a person's suffering. Okay, so some people have objected to the principle of beneficence reasoning we've been talking about here and say, look, we don't need voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. That's taking this way too far. Right? All we need is just to provide better pain management and psychiatric care. And if we can provide those things, we'll fulfill our duty of beneficence already. We won't have to resort to euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Right? You have a duty to end suffering. We do it with pain management. This seems plausible at first, but there are a number of responses, right? This reduces all relevant suffering to pain. But what about dignity, autonomy, and our effect on the well-being of loved ones, right? We talked about a number of reasons, or you read about a number of reasons, why a person might want euthanasia, why a person could be suffering from their terminal illness. And it's not all just physical pain and sort of psychiatric depression. Right? It can be about a loss of dignity and autonomy, and no amount of pain management is going to help with that. So depending on the person's type of suffering, this response isn't going to work. In addition, it says, look, we just need to provide better pain management and psychiatric care, but not everybody has access to those types of care. And so we can't say physician-assisted suicide and active euthanasia are ruled out because the duty of beneficence just requires we give them this care. If they don't have access to it, we may be required to satisfy that duty through other means. Right? Okay, and then finally, you need to look at the similarity reasons argument that Dan Brock gives. And roughly he says, look, almost everybody supports voluntary passive euthanasia because of the stuff we've been talking about so far, autonomy, well-being, and beneficence. All of those same reasons apply to voluntary active euthanasia. So if you believe voluntary passive euthanasia is permissible, you should also believe voluntary active euthanasia is permissible. Right? If we're worried about somebody's autonomy and well-being, and we have a duty of beneficence, and we think those apply in cases where all we need to do is remove a feeding tube, right, then they're also going to apply in these cases of active euthanasia. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this relates very closely to the distinction between killing and letting die, which is the subject of our next video. So we'll talk about that next. Thank you, everyone.